What navigation software does is it re-optimizes from that point in time. So you still want to get to your end destination, but you're at a new start point. What are the different ways you can get to your end point? In the context of a project or a schedule, I think that's about project agility, or even a bit of branding is anti-fragility. So when you have these changes, you're actually anticipating that there will be changes, and you will adapt and change your schedule and even change the sequence to still meet that final destination or that complete scope.
How we can think about setting up projects differently, but just one thought came to mind. When things go bad, people default to what they're known. And the classic for me is, if you're out on site on a project and it goes off the rails, the first thing they do is, we're doing a daily stand-up and everybody's getting in the room and we're going through the plan, we're going through every single activity, and you're committing to the tasks that you have committed to. And the interesting part about this to me, if the plan's not good, we're just committing to stuff that we don't know is good.
The phase that's really missing for me is the response. Because the thing is, when you're planning a project, you don't know exactly what risks will happen. Maybe you have some data or ideas, but which one of those 50 or 5 risks will happen, you'll only know when you're out on site. And so what I like about this pre-mortem is, when you do a pre-mortem, right, you play out this big issue happened, and what did we do about it?
Hi, folks. A quick one before we dive into this week's episode. Our book, The Critical Path Career, How to Advance in Construction Planning and Scheduling, is out now, and you can order it on Amazon. We'll include a link below. This is a great way to show support for the Beyond Deadlines podcast, and Greg and I have worked extremely hard taking everything we know in our 30 years of experience, plus everything we've picked up from shooting this podcast, and we've tried to pack it into an information-dense book that you can use right away. In the book, we have specific strategies on how to get a raise, how to get a promotion, and find a new job. We include 26 of the best interview questions that we have come across, in addition to 34 specific impact ideas that you can go use on your projects today. We want to thank everyone who's shown us support so far, and enjoy this week's episode. Welcome to the Beyond Deadlines podcast, where we tackle challenges that planning and schedule leaders come across on a day-to-day basis. My name is Micah Piippo, and I'm the CEO of Movar, a project management consultancy.
And my name's Georgia Stillwell. I'm a director at Alice Technologies.
Today's episode, we are going to have a little bit of a debate. We are working with a fictitious GC, and there's 2 camps that have formed. On one side, there's a camp that believes a predictable schedule is the only way to go. And on the other side is a camp that believes an agile schedule is the only way to go. I'm going to be on Team Predictable. We'll see how that goes. And Georgia here is going to be on Team Agile. So, Georgia, why don't you kick us off and have your opening arguments, if you will, for maybe just describe what an agile schedule is, because I think people probably might be gravitating towards, well, are you just talking about lean management or something like that? So why don't you kind of talk a little bit more about what you mean by an agile plan or schedule?
Sure. So I think at the beginning, with all good intentions, people set out and they make their plan, their schedule for the project. And at that point in time, it's a good plan. But in reality, everything changes. Well, the scope might stay the same, but risks happen. It's part of life. Productivity changes as well. And that one plan or that critical path that they set out with is not the best path anymore. But people are fixated on it. They love looking at those red bars and looking at, the float around them. When I think in reality, I want to think more, Google Maps, more navigation software, which is when something happens or you make a wrong turn, instead of, reversing your 4x4 and causing chaos, what navigation software does is it re-optimizes from that point in time. So you still want to get to your end destination, but you're at a new start point. So what are the different ways you can get to your end point? So in the context of a project or a schedule, I think that's about project agility, or even a bit of branding is anti-fragility. So that when you have these changes, You're actually anticipating that there will be changes and you will adapt and change your schedule and even change the sequence to still meet that final destination or that complete scope.
That makes a ton of sense, but since I'm arguing against you, I'll say that doesn't make a ton of sense. And I guess where my mind then goes next is, okay, well, couldn't I just immediately swallow you up and say, that's a part of predictability? I'm going to put a bunch of buffers in my schedule and now I'm predictable and I'm also agile.
Well, I think buffers has been a response, right? So back in the beginning or the first schedules that people made, they were kind of fragile, right? You had one way to get from A to B, and then people realized, I don't catch the traffic lights, I'm not going to make it on time. So what do? They build in buffers, but they still want to take the same path. But you've built in an extra 5 minutes or a schedule, maybe a few months of contingency to absorb that you might not hit the productivity you're planning. You might have bad weather, things might go wrong. And that works up until a point, right? And you try make an assessment of what that point is. Maybe you do some risk modeling. Maybe you get some really detailed historical data and make these predictions. But predictions, they still don't tell you what is going to happen and when. There's always probabilities involved. And it's kind of like life. It's how you react to the situation, right? So that's why I think that predictability, it's a starting point, but in reality, we need to deliver these projects. And that means we need to change. We need to be agile and like anti-fragile and be ready to change our sequence and how we plan to deliver the project.
Yeah. Well, what about when you get the McLeamy curve? Is that what it's called? Where basically says, as a project goes along, the cost to impact the project goes up and your ability to impact the project goes down. I think I was doing some research on that and I think he stole it from another guy. But needless to say, we won't get into that here. When we're talking about predictability and being agile and then your ability to impact the curve, I get this at the beginning, as you can start kind of making those. But then I guess where this falls apart to me in my mind is like, now you're kind of, let's say, midway through the project and you don't have as many resources and abilities to change it. I guess, how does that start to fall apart? Because at a certain point in time, you just got to say, this is the work we have left. We have to plan it out in this way. And that's kind of predictable. And we've, burned some of our options or our buffers and things like that. How does it continue, I guess, throughout the project in a really long, drawn out, bumbly answer for me?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And you're right. Like the earlier you are in the project, you can make full strategy changes and it maybe not have a huge impact on the bottom line. If you're knees deep out on site to make a change, you're making a global change and everyone needs to know about it. And that's complicated and contracts have been let, documents have been signed. So it is harder, but I think that's kind of a bit of our own doing, right? Like contracts are set up this way because we've become obsessed with this critical path and this plan we set that we sent in with the contract is the plan, but it's not giving space for that flexibility. And maybe you don't need to change your plan every day. Maybe you have a tolerance that you set and you go, okay, when this is starting to look like we're 2 weeks, what is your risk appetite? 2 weeks, it's off schedule. Then we're going to look at pressing the button and seeing what a rescheduling might look like or rebaselining, and then we're going to go for it. And you can also do things like set a window for, okay, we know we need to change, but the next 2 weeks, we're going to leave our current plan because it's too hard to get everyone to change the next day. But from that 2-week period onward, then we're going with literally plan B or plan C. Like I want to encourage those A, B, C, D, E, F plans because in making that change, you're going for a better outcome. You don't make a change just because it's fun. It takes an effort to make a change, so it needs to be worth that investment to pay off and still meet the project outcome you're after. So there is a balance. You can make changes easier at the beginning. It's better then. But I still think being open-minded to a change, especially if the project is hurting, because there's lots of studies when the project's under stress or even outside of construction industry, people default, they go into autopilot, they go to basic. And actually that often hurts the project further because you go back to doing it the same way as always, which, hasn't really paid off. I think there's a lot of stats about that, and it takes courage to be like, it's going bad and I'm going to change the game. So that's the dare I put out to project directors, is to be ready to resequence.
I'd like to jump into how we can think about setting up projects differently, but just one thought came to mind when you said like when things go bad, people default to what they're known. And the classic for me is if you're out on site on a project and it goes off the rails, the first thing they do is we're doing a daily stand up and everybody's getting in the room and we're going through the plan, and we're going through every single activity and you're committing to the tasks that you have committed to. And the interesting part about this to me, I'm like, well, if the plan's not good, we're just committing to stuff that we don't know is good. And then the other one is all these people who should be out in the site actually working and doing things are now sitting in this conference room all together. I've just never seen that sort of action create a really strong reaction to pull projects back in and bring it back in. There's this giant elephant in the room when it comes to most projects. And the giant elephant in the room is always they need to be delivered at a certain point in time because that's what meets a customer need. And so across all industries I've worked in, and I'm sure someone's going to go in the comments and name all the exceptions to this, but for most things, like the stadium needs to be built by the fall to have the first game in. The data center needs to be built by this period to serve the cat videos in Iowa. The chip plant needs to be built to meet our demand. You know what I mean? There's always that fixed wall. And I feel like that often creates a lot of then cascading effects. That is the reason why we can't be agile or do this or do that. So how do you counterbalance that kind of fixed position of this is when it needs to be delivered by?
I'm actually all about the fixed position. By being agile, I'm not saying like let's be agile on the end date. Actually, what I break the project or the schedule down into is what are the rules, things that are non-negotiable. And that is maybe the end date because we need to get the cat videos in Iowa. And there are other non-negotiables like we have to dig the foundations before we pour the foundations, non-negotiable. But then there are parts that are flexible or they're variable, which could be the number of people you have on site, number of electricians you have in the data center, the sequencing you do your commissioning in. And so what I think a agile or an anti-fragile schedule has is it always meets the rules, but it plays with the variables to meet that rule, which is the end date. So what happens is, okay, you have some permit is late to site. That's kind of a new rule now. You have to start later, but you still have the same end date. Now, what variables need to change? We need to either bring more people onto the site. We need to change the sequence. There are so many variables in projects. It's actually hard for a human to figure out what is the best way to deliver it. And that's why we have great AI tools today to solve those problems. So yeah, it's the same cascade, but it's what is the cascade on the variables? Like which variables do we dial up and down to still achieve that fixed rule or that fixed constraint end date?
Yeah, I will concede you on that point. 1 point again for you. I think the scoreboard is adding up here. Predictability team, I need to call somebody in because
Go
I'm losing quickly.
predictability team, come on.
Yeah, I know. Drink some more of this coffee and hope it works out. One area that I found super interesting is in America, typically, there'll always be a project risk register at the beginning. And it's like the saddest versions usually of risk registers that I see where it's an Excel spreadsheet and it's got that green, yellow, orange. And it ends up being like either an absurdly small list or an absurdly long list. You never find that kind of sweet spot. They're listing out like, well, we might not be able to buy a stop sign for the site. And that's $1,000. And it's 1,000% always cost focused. What I've come to really think about and processes that I've always enjoyed is looking through that as a different lens of saying, instead of calling this like a risk register, I don't know if this is still an appropriate term, but like a pre-mortem. I think people got off the term of post-mortem because it's a little dark, but doing like a pre-mortem for a project and looking at it through that way, does that play into like the anti-fragile type mindset? And then, walk us through how that would look and especially how that would be different than a risk, what I just described previously, because I feel like that is a beautiful exercise. But every time I bring it up, people are like, ooh, it's just like a risk thing. I'm like, no, it's different.
Yeah, I actually love what you're speaking about because my background it's in project risk and I spent years doing it. And people are really obsessed with analyzing risk and forecasting risk. And you get beautiful curves and you get a probability of achieving your project end date. But it's just that phase. The phase that's really missing for me is the response. Because the thing is, when you're planning a project, you don't know exactly what risks will happen. Maybe you have some data or ideas, but which one of those 50 or 5 risks will happen, you'll only know when you're out on site. And so what I like about this pre-mortem is when you do a pre-mortem, right, you play out this big issue happened and what did we do about it? I spent years telling people, hey, your project's going to be delayed. Good luck with it. And now I'm much more about, hey, if you face this delay, like these are the variables you should play with. X, Y, Z, changing the calendars for this one crew, bringing in more people, bringing in an extra crane maybe, or just changing the sequence is going to solve your problem. So it's much more like tactical and focused on the risk response as opposed to just like putting all these risks into a dying risk register. It's more the contingency planning. It's more the anti-fragile, like the reaction. And in risk management, it's all like, let's be proactive. Let's think about risk now, which is valid because if you don't think about it, that's not going to go well. But the reaction is an important part because that's actually what you pay those project directors and superintendents to do is to, when something's gone wrong on site, they're drawing on all of their experience and going, I think we need the electricians to work Saturdays and it's going to sort it out. But actually, humans are biased. They'll come up with their best idea based on experience. And you can easily run these things with algorithms now. Like, is it the electricians working Saturdays or is it the fitters, doing this? Or is it just adding one more person per gang that's going to make the difference? So pre-mortem, reaction, anti-fragile, they're like all in a family together that I want to make more noise about.
Yeah, I'm just kind of getting a little more tactical on this too. What I usually see is that on that electrician example, then it's when it comes to pass and you actually need those electricians, there is a $5 million cost. And you have to go then get that approved up the chain of command. And then someone at some point rejects it, has questions about it. And to me, it's one of those ones that is sometimes wild to think about where we called this out 6 months ago. And to me, it should be we called it out. And maybe if it was getting into the tactic piece as mentioned, or more called out of like, if this happens, then we'll go do this. And we should just be able to bypass this, or you should be made more aware of it because this is like our tactical. This is what we're going to do to save time and execute quickly. But you never see that. It's always, oh, now we got to go. This is like some big shock and we got to go back up through the chain of command and make sure it's approved and goes through the change management process. And, now you have to rerun a risk analysis. Do you see on this kind of anti-fragile world where many of these things, maybe you start with something that's kind of like that initial risk thing. And then you really have we're going to go do this, this, and this. And it's less up in the air to go execute.
Yeah, so I think it's a paradigm shift because people are used to working with this. Let's make a risk register, it goes to die. Let's make this critical path. This is how we're going to execute, and less ready to react. And actually, there was a study, and I wish I could remember it exactly, but people that do the scenario planning, so you actually say, hey, this thing does blow up. How are we going to react? Okay, the electrician's example. And you guys do that as a exercise, hypothetical in the room. It means when it does happen, people are less shocked and they're like ready to act because it hasn't been this big, 5 million on electricians. It's like, oh yeah, we did the scenario planning and we knew that we were going to have to react to something. And now it's happening. And I'm so glad that we did the dress rehearsal, like I'll press the button. So it is a bit of a paradigm shift because people aren't used to it. It's more common in like military and defense, this kind of thinking. It's a bit more normalized. And slowly it will feed through to construction, trying to push it forward, but we'll get there step by step.
Yeah. No, and I feel like in those scenarios, you probably have to have a plan B, plan C, plan D. Do you see, teams having, when they're doing maybe like a baseline workshop or some of those earlier functions, do you see teams, adding this on to the things they're going to do? Like, hey, we're going to accept a schedule baseline, but before we do, let's walk out like what we'll exactly do for some of maybe like the bigger issues. And then maybe these can kind of cascade down to like smaller, you show up one day and like you don't have a crew or something. But I'm just thinking more of like hey, the generators are now 4 months late. Do you see teams being able to add that sort of, kind of step by step, you'll do this, I'll do this type thing?
Yeah, so I think it's a process that people need to operationalize. Is everyone doing it today? Definitely not. I'll tell you who's really good at doing it, like industrial turnarounds. So when they shut down some industrial site for 4 days and they're like renewing some equipment or adding some equipment, they've done a bunch of scenario planning because every minute, hour that they're late bringing that back online is costing a lot. And so they're very much familiar with, code red. I've had them call it like these situations and how would we react? And it's already part of their process. They've done it weeks in advance. And so when it comes time to deliver, it's less surprising. So operationalizing it, it's a change kind of management function that needs to happen, I think, for GCs, for owners. The more sophisticated players are already onto it, and hopefully we see it trickle down and become more common. And especially as tools become more accessible on how they can do this, it's not somebody who has to go like pull up P6 and they're like, what would happen in this scenario? Let me just like unpick 6,000 links and try re-accurately link them together without doing any planning witchery. That's a really time-intensive exercise, but there are tools out there like Alice, where I work today, that definitely help with that. So it's more accessible. It's not so onerous to like improve the quality of your processes.
I'm going to jump into the tools in just a second, but I do want to talk a little bit about kind of culture of this, because I do see this as a process type operation, but also a culture operation. And when I was working at Google, a lot of these data centers, the demand for the cat videos are going up and down constantly. And so they're starting and stopping projects consistently. And that would kind of rattles people's cages a ton where, oh, hey, we're going to go build this project, out in Florida or wherever. And it would get all planned, get all ready to go. And then demand would drop and be like, oh, we're going to hold. And then we're going to go. And in my mind was, if we could just absorb this as this is the way the world works, kind of going back to your rules, and everything we build process wise should map to, I always think of it as like an ocean rather than like a river. River just has a constant stream and you can build a bridge over it. But most people don't build bridges over the ocean because it's coming in and out and long distance go break the bridge. So like, why don't we work on building boats instead of bridges? That's kind of where my mind went. How do you see this playing out from a bigger kind of cultural, I'm a large owner and I kind of want to build these processes in everything we do. How do you see that working out?
So like any process change, it takes time and effort. And it's super important to have someone at the top who's going to lead that cultural change, whether it's for being a boat in the river or something else the organization is doing. Having that sponsor at the executive level, finding some champions or users at the more ground level and then bringing them together. But it needs a concerted effort. These things take years, and it does depend on the organization. The more mature it is, often it's a bit harder to change and the size of it. But the smaller organizations and the startups, they're making these changes pretty swiftly. And often when you have a new leader come in, it's pretty common. They'll be like, this is the new lay of the land. And that can be shocking for people, but it can be a super fast way to make that transformation. But along with any transformation, there has to be education, because if people don't understand why, it just feels like extra work, extra process, admin. But if it can be linked together on like why it is important for them or how it makes their life easier, it's gonna make everything a lot smoother.
Awesome. Wow, that's perfect. Well, tell us a little bit about Alice. You mentioned it earlier, running scenarios. I've been in that scenario of, hey, can you make like these 6 different options? And boy, is that such a fun experience. And then you finish it, you bring it in, they're like, oh, wait, I think we need an 8th option. And you're like, I've just done so much work and I have to go redo it. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how Alice makes this process easier?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give you a little lead in as well. So I mentioned I work in risk, and I told a lot of people about assessed schedule risk and told them, hey, your project looks like it's going to be delayed or it's not very achievable. But also these analyses are built on top of a schedule. And people sometimes knew or are pretty forthright that the schedule, it doesn't actually reflect reality. It's contractual, like, we keep everything offline. And so I really wanted to get to the heart of great scheduling. And I thought Alice is actually trying to change the game on this. They're not just replicating what's out there, but kind of redefining scheduling, or at least trying to within the existing paradigm. So Alice, it's a schedule development and optimization tool. And it works kind of as I suggested. You set rules or constraints and you set variables. And with that, the AI is running all the different scenarios within those boundaries. Also, one thing I love about it is if it can't meet the rules, it'll say, hey, it's not possible with these rules and these limits you've given me. Whereas if you did that in P6, it'd just give you some negative float and the end date still finish on time, all good, all smiles. Whereas it say, hey, not super achievable. Why don't you change these variables? Which is, it becomes really helpful. Planners become more influencers and they're not spending all their time unlinking, relinking, playing with crunching the plan. They're actually saying, hey, I looked at all these scenarios and this is the cheapest way for us to make the end date better. And when the project changes over time, that agile or anti-fragile, they're not there like sweating, unlinking all the schedule, getting in the spaghetti of links. They're going, hey, guys, the best way is electricians, 2 hours extra in the month of May. It's going to sort this out. Like, I've checked all the options already. And they become influencers as opposed to really fighting with some of the software and tools that are out there today. So that's why I like working at Alice, because I feel like we're helping people actually deliver these projects and taking some of the grunt work out of it and making it easier to make decisions.
Yeah. If you like grunt work, don't get Alice. If you don't like grunt work and you're tired of updating those 6,000 links to go check if you need a couple more electricians or do that, definitely check out Alice. Highly recommend it. It saves a ton of time on projects and doing really complex analysis. So even if you're a little bit earlier in your schedule or planning game, it can really help upskill you and start showing you what some of these, different scenarios are. And I love the schedule influencer that you just said. Absolutely brilliant. Cool.
You're definitely a schedule influencer, Micah.
Well, I sure don't want to be. Oh, but someone's got to wear that cape, I guess. Georgia, thank you so much for coming on. Really, really appreciate it. Any final words, any final thoughts? I think you beat the predictability out of me. I will give you your medal is in the mail as we speak. The champion of I'm actually just a huge anti-fragile fan. I think people probably realize that because I jumped ship pretty quickly, but any final thoughts you want to leave the crowd with?
Yeah, if I'm allowed, at Alice, we're hiring at the moment, pretty much all over the world, also in my team. If you want to join someone that's into agility and anti-fragility, but also in North America, in Europe, in both customer success, so working with clients that are in the construction industry. If you've thought about leaving the site office and working for a software company, maybe this is the sign you've been asking for. Definitely look at those roles and we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I couldn't encourage people more to take a look at Alice and those roles. It'd be a really cool resume builder. You get really awesome experience. And I know when I was looking for Google, when we were hiring, higher level, senior level scheduling positions and up, I'm constantly looking for something unique and interesting. And just from people I've been speaking with in the industry, this is something that would do that for your resume and then also for your career. And so highly recommend checking those out. Well, folks, that's all for this week. We really appreciate you tuning in. If you could like or subscribe and share with your friends and coworkers, unless they're on the predictability camp, and they probably don't want to listen to this one. But if they're not, feel free to like and share. Have a good one, and we'll see you next week.